Next public hearing is Recon Services LLC ZB-2018-21 site plan application with bulk and use variances for the construction of multifamily residential building at 48 Courtlandt Street, Block 65, lots 14.01, 16, 17, 19.01, 21, 22, 23.01, and 25, and city right away at Duke and Central Avenue, zoning district R-5A and C1.
Yes, members of the board, excuse me, Thomas F. Kelso on behalf of the applicant, Recon Services LLC. As the board, I'm sure, is familiar, having reviewed the file, I'm pleased to be before you this evening representing Recon Services for what we believe is a very exciting project to be located at the Courtlandt Street, Duke Street intersection. The project is for a preliminary and final site plan together with variance approvals to construct a 5-story residential apartment building which will contain 94 units. The units are broken down as 19 studios, 39 one-bedrooms, 24 two-bedrooms, and 12 three-bedroom units, and also with a underground parking garage for 99 parking spaces. The property is located at the intersections of Courtlandt Street, Central Avenue, Delavan Street, and Duke Street. The lot blocks are block 65, lots 1401, 16, 17, 1901, 21, 22, 2301, and 25, and on the current tax map. I would also note a somewhat unique situation that a part of this site plan is currently identified as a portion of the Duke Street right-of-way. If those of you who I know are familiar with the area, you'll see how that intersection there is somewhat unusual in that there is a triangular piece of property that's in the right-of-way, plus Duke Street runs between the properties that are included in this site and that triangle piece of property. The applicant is proposing to include that site right-of-way as part of the overall development site. The City Council has, by resolution, which was passed in April of 2019, consented to the applicant providing that property as part of this application for the board's consideration. I think the city believed that it was appropriate for there to be a public hearing on the project itself and permitted the applicant to do so in order to get that public comment. And again, that resolution also involved a public hearing to get the council's consent to do that. So, although it's somewhat unique, the project itself would be a significant change to the location where it's being proposed. As you know, there is currently a property that is in the process of being environmentally remediated, which is the service station that's located at the corner of Duke Street and Courtlandt Street. That property is included in this site. The property does run back to Delafield Street for properties that run along the corner of Delafield and Courtlandt Street. And it really creates a fairly significant development site that we believe will be a statement building for that location to help stabilize the neighborhood and provide good new quality housing for the area. Our intent is to provide 5 witnesses for you. I know 5 is more than we like to do, but we will try to keep them as brief as possible. I will provide 2 testimonies with regard to Mid-Atlantic engineering, one with regard to their typical engineering site planning, but also we have the licensed site remediation professional associated with Mid-Atlantic here this evening to testify, to give you background on the environmental condition of the site and what's being done with regard to remediation, as well as how this development site actually positively impacts that. We will provide architectural testimony, as well as traffic testimony and planning testimony, which will hopefully support the variances that are being requested. The variances are as follows. We have a building height variance of 53.6 feet, whereas a maximum of 40 is permitted. There's a building coverage variance of 60.9%, whereas a maximum of 40 is permitted. We have an impervious coverage variance of 97.8%, whereas a maximum of 90% is permitted. A floor area ratio of 2.57 to 1 versus 1.0 to 1. We have a parking variance providing for 99 parking spaces where 179 are required. The board will recognize for many applications, the city has always viewed projects like this to be supported by at least one parking space per unit. We are providing 99 parking spaces, and as I've already indicated, there are 94 units in the project, so we feel that that's more than adequate, not only considering what historically the city has viewed as positive, but also the particular location where this property is, very near to the university campus. We also have a variance that is somewhat gray area, whether it's a variance or not, but we've identified it and we're going to testify to it, but we're not certain that we actually think it's necessary. And that's a landscape buffer to a residential use. No landscape buffer, whereas a 10-foot landscape buffer is required to residential property. We couldn't find the identification of it in the ordinance. It is identified in Mr. Dignell's report. We recognize where that location is, and we believe, provide support for that variance. And finally, there is a variance for parking within 3 feet of a property line. We understand that that is a variance here, but it's technical because the parking is actually underground. So although we need a variance, so we're building that underground garage to the property line, it actually is there for a variance, but you can't see it, it's underground. And that is the sum total of the variances that are being requested. Again, as an overall, I think when you see what the architect has developed, and I know you're familiar with this architect who's done some other projects recently within the 5th, 6th Ward and elsewhere, that this will be a very significant complement to that location, really help to stabilize the neighborhood, bring a new vitality to the neighborhood, while being in such proximity to the university that it will provide what we believe will be quality upscale housing for likely undergraduate students. The project itself is residential, it's open to everyone, but I think the expectation is that this is a property that will be marketed to university students because of its location. With that as an overview, unless the board has any questions for me or issues, I will call my first witness.
Your first witness, please.
Yes, just what I'd like to do is, I'm not going to call him as a witness, he's available for answering a question, but Mr. Perry Pavlicek is the principal of Recon. We always think it's necessary to put a face to the name. We incorporated his testimony for some of the other witnesses to shorten it, but Mr. Pavlicek is here to answer questions, obviously, for each party.
Thanks for your time.
At this time, I would call Mr. Kevin Shelley for testimony.
Evening.
Please state your name, spell your last name.
My name is Kevin Shelley, S-H-E-L-L-Y.
Do you swear or affirm to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
You may proceed.
Mr. Shelley, you are a licensed professional engineer of the state of New Jersey, is that correct?
Correct.
And in that capacity, you're familiar with all the civil engineering aspects of the project as I've described it, as proposed to the board this evening?
Correct.
Could you then give the board the benefit of your professional qualifications and experience?
Sure. I'm a licensed professional engineer in the state of New Jersey. I have testified in front of various planning and zoning boards across the state, recently in front of Courtlandt Township, South Brunswick, North Caldwell, and the city of Camden. I've been involved with the design and permitting of multi-family housing over the past 10 years, doing thousands of units across the state. And I have testified in front of various boards before.
I would offer Mr. Shelley for as qualified engineer to provide testimony.
We'll accept them as qualified.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kevin, if you could give us an overview of the site plan, and I know we have some exhibits to utilize, and I'm going to allow you to just
Sure.
do your thing.
A1. A1. So the exhibit which I'm referencing, which I've been marked as A1, is an overall site rendering of the project. As Mr. Kelso has described to you, the property is bound by Delafield Street, Courtlandt Street, and Duke Street. And as part of the application, we are proposing to vacate a portion of the Duke Street right-of-way, which is an extension to the bottom of the project here. Doing so creates additional property frontages along Lewis Street and Central Avenue. The subject properties are 8 total parcels, and with the right-of-way vacation of Duke Street, all these properties will be consolidated into a single lot, totaling 40,610 square feet. The current lots are split into 2 different zones, with the lots fronting on Duke Street being in the C1 zone, and lots fronting on Delafield Street being within the R5A zone. The Courtlandt Plaza Apartments propose to redevelop the site for use as multifamily apartment building. The existing buildings in the immediate vicinity of the property are predominantly utilized as single-family and student housing. The project proposes the construction of a 5-story apartment building atop a subsurface parking structure. The building will consist of 94 1-, 2-, and 3-bedroom units, with 99 off-street parking spaces located in the subsurface garage, including 4 handicap parking spaces. Vehicular access to the subsurface parking garage comes from Courtlandt Street. As you can see on the rendering, there's a driveway apron with a ramp down to the parking garage. And pedestrian access to the building is provided at the main lobby located at the intersection of Courtlandt Street and Lewis Street. There is secondary pedestrian access to the building from Delafield Street, which comes via a restricted gate access for the residents only to use the rear entrance of the building as well. As we mentioned, the application proposes the vacation of a portion of Duke Street, which really serves 2 purposes. As Mr. Kelso mentioned, the current configuration of Duke Street, Lewis Street, Central Avenue creates a traffic design that does not meet any type of applicable standards. So what we'll be doing is vacating that portion, extending Central Avenue to Lewis, and creating an overall improved traffic geometry and a safer intersection. The second thing that this right-of-way vacation will also do is it creates a open public plaza space that we have shown in here, which isn't fenced off or blocked for resident use only, but it creates a nice outdoor plaza space for the public to use. As part of the overall construction, again, we have a subsurface parking garage, and the rendering that's in front of you shows what the property looks like from an aerial view or from the first floor. You'll see there's various green space around the building, as well as the overall building envelope as well. All trash, waste, and recycling are stored internally within the trash compactor room. Building management will wheel the trash out for scheduled pickup, which will be through a private contractor. There's a door located right next to the entrance off of Courtlandt Street, where trash will be wheeled out, picked up, and brought back in for the scheduled pickup. We would anticipate twice a week trash pickup. If the trash demand for the property dictates more, then it would be increased as necessary to serve the residents. Since we are making modifications along all these frontages, all the property perimeter curbs and sidewalks will be removed and replaced as part of the application. Adjacent to these residential uses on the right-hand side, which is the east property line of the site, there will be a retaining wall installed along the property lines with a 6-foot fence for safety reasons and for screening reasons along the wall. The subject site is on the lower end of those retaining walls, and which we'll discuss a little little further when we're talking about the screening and buffer requirements that Mr. Kelso mentioned. Within the subsurface parking garage, there are 99 off-street parking spaces, as well as various locations for bike racks. We would anticipate upwards of 50 bikes would be parked very easily within the spaces allocated within the garage. The relief that we are requesting, the maximum building lot coverage of 60.9%, whereas 40% is required. Maximum lot impervious coverage, 97.8%, where 90% is the max required or allowed. And the minimum parking setback, where 0 feet is proposed and 3 feet is the requirement. For the parking setback, as Mr. Kelso mentioned, the subsurface parking garage does go down to the property lines. So while these vehicles are within 3 feet of the property line, they are below grade in the subsurface parking garage, out of view, not impacting the neighbors in terms of screening or cars, vehicles, located right on the properties. While the building coverage exceeds the allowable coverage, the proposed 60.9% is consistent with the neighborhood and other similar approved projects within the city. I think as you can see on the plan, the proposed building, while it does take up a significant portion of the property, there is quite a bit of green space around the building for landscaping, mainly because we were able to get that parking down underneath the building. And the maximum impervious coverage, we were very conservative with our 97.8 calculation, and we took that as the entire area that is taken up by the subsurface parking garage, when in reality, like I mentioned, there is green space above the parking garage. So when you're looking at the site, there isn't 97.8% of pavement or building or concrete. There is landscape space, there is outdoor space, there's green space. It's not just an entire building or a building and parking. But to be conservative, we decided to say that this was 97.8% and to ask for the relief. But we believe that we met the intent of the ordinance by keeping the parking below grade away from the neighbors and by promoting some green space on the property as well. The subject property or relief is requested from the minimum off-street parking requirements. 179 spaces are required, 99 spaces are proposed. The site is within walking or bike riding distance to both Rutgers as well as St. Peter's University Hospital. So the site is located in close proximity to both of those establishments. The management of the property will lease or assign parking spaces to the tenants, and the garage will be controlled via security cameras, so there is no unwarranted parking or use of the parking area. It's meant for the residents only. We feel as Mr. Kelso mentioned, we are exceeding the typical 1 space per unit that has been approved in a lot of other multifamily projects within the city. So we believe the proposed relief in the parking standards are warranted. Building will be serviced by both public water and sewer, and all utilities to the building will all be underground. In terms of stormwater management, there is a small infiltration trench located on the east side of the property. This trench has been designed in accordance with the city standards for engineering, utility, and landscaping. And I believe as outlined in the board engineer's letter, they have requested some additional stormwater analysis, including some groundwater mounting, which we'll gladly comply with to provide that.
Excuse me, but while you're on that subject, for the record, you have reviewed Mr. Carley's report.
Yes.
We provided an overall engineering review of the site. Are we in the position to represent that we will comply with that report?
Yes. The existing site is currently developed, and trees do exist on the site that will be removed. The applicant will plant replacement trees and contribute to the city's tree replacement fund. A total of 26 trees will be removed from the properties, and by ordinance, that would require 82 3-inch caliber trees. We are proposing to install 22 trees and contribute to the tree replacement fund for the deficit. As Mr. Kelso mentioned, we are not entirely sure whether the 10-foot landscape buffer variance is required or not, but along the adjoining residential properties on the right hand of the rendering here, there is a small retaining wall along the property line. There is a fence located at the top of the wall. This fence and the wall will create a screening to the neighboring properties where designating 10 feet for landscaping, we don't believe enhances or creates any type of screening that the wall and the fence do not already provide. And finally, as was pointed out in the city engineer's review letter, a design waiver is required from the section 11 of the engineering utility landscape standards for site lighting, where the lighting shall not exceed 0.25 foot candles at the property line. In this instance, our proposed site lighting does extend beyond the property lines along our frontages, along Delafield, Courtlandt, Lewis, and Central Avenue, because we are providing new street lighting out there. So to create a safe environment for the right-of-ways, as for the residents, we are proposing lights which do extend out into the right-of-way. So that triggers the required design waiver from the lighting standards. All lighting, whether it's pole-mounted, building-mounted, or the garage-mounted lighting, they are all LED fixtures. So we have LED fixtures throughout the entire project, and that's really all I have in terms of describing the site plan.
Just one question. Because there was one comment on the report that we revised. I think there is now a loading zone that's identified.
Yeah, so along Central Avenue, we have a loading zone designated. This space would be utilized for resident move-in, move-out, and it would be located right off of Central Avenue so they can pull in easily and pull out.
All right, thank you. No further questions. If the board wishes to.
Was that loading zone approved by the city of New Brunswick already?
Not yet. That would be a condition of.
Oh, okay. All right.
Because we would have to go back to the council with regard to the right-of-way, and then we would, whatever improvements and encroachments, there would have to be all part of the application.
Thank you. Anyone from?
Yes, the lighting, you mentioned it'll go out into the public right-of-way. Will that be just across the sidewalk and into the street, or will it extend across the road into other homes?
So there's a 4-foot grass strip between the curb line and the sidewalks. That's where the street trees and the light fixtures will go. The lights do not have enough throw to cross the street and affect any adjoining properties. It's strictly within the immediate vicinity of the light.
Any other questions or comments with this?
If not, thank you.
Thank you.
At this time, I will call Mr. Richard Sissi for testimony.
Say your name, spell your last name.
Richard Sisti, S-I-S-T-I.
Do you swear or affirm to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
You may proceed.
Mr. Sisti, you are a licensed site remediation professional,
I am,
correct?
correct,
An LSRP for
for sure.
short, which I think is a common term now people understand. Could you give the board the benefit of your professional qualifications and experience?
I have been actively engaged in the investigation and remediation of contaminated properties for approximately 28 years. I've submitted probably several hundred reports to the DEP, and I've probably closed probably well over 100 contaminated sites with the DEP in New Jersey.
I would offer Mr. Sisti as an appropriate licensed professional for environmental personnel.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, just, are you the LSRP for this site?
I am not. She is on maternity leave.
Okay, but you're
So
familiar
I'm-
with
I'm
this
Phil,
site?
and I am familiar with it.
We'll accept it.
Thank you. If you could, Mr. Sisti, give us a little bit of background with regard to the environmental condition of the site, our role in that as the purchaser of the property, and the impact of the construction of the project, and how that actually impacts positively or negatively with regard to the remediation.
Sure. So the history of the property is that it has been a service station, a gasoline service station, up until 2002 when the underground tanks were removed. The property also was a automotive repair garage, and it still maintains that operation today, at least a portion of the property at 19 Duke Street. The owner removed the tanks in 2002. They no longer pumped gasoline. At the time the tanks were removed, there was evidence of a discharge. This was reported to the DEP. There was some investigation completed from 2002 to about 2010, and that showed that the soil and the groundwater were both contaminated with gasoline components, as well as chlorinated solvents, which you would typically find associated in automotive repair operations, and most likely associated with the waste oil tanks. In 2012, a vapor intrusion study was done as required by the DEP. 6 adjoining properties were tested to see if any gasoline vapors were entering the basements. That was negative. There were no vapor issues. In 2018, Mid-Atlantic Engineering Partners was retained by the applicant to conduct an investigation to determine the extent of contamination, and that was completed in December of 2018 and January, February of this year. And the results of that investigation indicate there's approximately 670 cubic yards of contaminated soil, and there is groundwater contamination remains, and that is predominantly confined to the property, though it does extend out off the property boundary into the street. The applicant is proposing an underground parking garage, which works very well with the need to excavate this 670 cubic yards of soil, which right now could not be done because there's existing buildings there. So the process of redeveloping the property will allow the contaminated soil to be removed, which in turn helps to remediate the groundwater because it acts as a secondary source of the contamination. So once that, assuming that the project moved forward, once that is completed, then we would monitor the groundwater and bring that into compliance and eventually close the case with the DEP.
No further questions, Mr. Sisti?
Any member of the board have a question? Seeing none, it is what it is.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
At this time, I will call Steve Schock for testimony.
Please say your name, spell your last name.
My name is Stephen Schock, S-C-H-O-C-H.
Do you swear or affirm to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
May I proceed?
Mr. Shaw, you testified before this board many times.
I have.
Have your credentials changed in any way since?
All intact and good standing.
All right. Well accepted as an expert.
Thank you. It's good to be before you again.
If you would then, Steve, if you could give an overview of the project proposed development building and the various aspects of the building that are.
Sure, and I'll try to not be redundant to what other people said. But I wanted to start by talking about the market for this apartment building. Yes, students are likely part of the marketplace, as they are part of the marketplace in any residential project in the city of New Brunswick. That simply is the demographics. These are conventional apartments, however. They're studios, 1, 2, 3 bedroom apartments. They are managed just like conventional apartments are. And the intention is to, while they may be of appeal to the student population, they'll also be of appeal to the general workforce here in the city, and hopefully also to the workforce that's associated with the medical center, intern, graduate students, and things like that. So the idea is that it's not purpose-built student housing. I know that this board understands what purpose-built student housing is, It's designed differently and it's managed differently. This is managed and designed as a conventional apartment building. I think that point of clarity is necessary. That said, I'll give you a little bit more detail on the mix. At the 19 studio apartments, they average about 509 square feet each. 39 one-bedroom apartments range from 679 square feet to 750 square feet. The 24 two-bedroom apartments range from 1,100 to 1,210 square feet for a two-bedroom apartment. So these are generous sizes for the bedroom mixes compared to some of the other apartment buildings that we've spoken about before. And the 12 three-bedroom units, they range from 1,260 square feet to as much as 1,400 square feet for a three-bedroom apartment. Overall, the project has 142 bedrooms in that mix. That's a cumulative mix. It's important to note, however, that on the site currently, there are buildings that have 23 bedrooms currently there, so those will be removed. There's a net addition of 119 bedrooms through the demolition and construction of the new project. Again, 5 stories, 53.6 feet in height. So let me talk a little bit about the building design. And I have 2 new exhibits. I don't know if you've got small versions for members of the board, and this is a PDF of the 2 new exhibits.
PDF will be marked as a 2 collectively then? It's on a flash drive? Mr. Shaw?
Yes,
All of the new exhibits are on the flash drive?
both of the 2 new exhibits are on our
And that's what we're passing around right now.
That is what is being passed around as well.
So why don't we mark the one on the left as A2, and then the one on the right as A3?
Okay, and for the record, the A2 is the view from Courtlandt and, sorry, this is the view from Delafield, and A3 is the view of the entrance at Courtlandt Street. Okay, so from a design standpoint, when looking to do apartment buildings in the neighborhood, each site it has different characteristics and different frontages, different perceptions. Because the consolidated land actually has 3 public street frontages, this is a building that is going to be noticeable. So it's something that the applicant desired to make a strong entrance statement and create a good gateway. So referring to A3, which is the view of the primary entrance, you can see how the entrance to the corner has been set back. And Mr. Shelley talked about the consolidation of the Duke Street right-of-way in that small triangular parcel. This is an opportunity to take a rather confusing intersection in the city, one that has been dominated by vehicles and cars, and really return it to the pedestrian route. And not just to take it and build on every inch of it, but we potentially set that back, and as you saw in the site plan, allowed some space in front of the building in this area to create really a public plaza, a place that can function both in terms of building and its plaza or courtyard in front of it, so that it really becomes a dynamic gateway and a signature building coming in this direction. The building overall, at its highest, as was said, 5 stories, 53 feet. However, there are 2 locations, one which is along the frontage of Delafield, where we do take the opportunity to mass the building down. So along Delafield, it masses down to 4 stories, and the same type of treatment happens along Central, where the building abuts its closest residential neighbor. Again, it goes from 5 stories to 4 stories on that area. This is a building that is not a cookie cutter type of design. While we've got 4 types of units, there are actually 12 different unit types that go into this, including some 2-story units, multi-level units. Those units that front on Delafield actually have front doors and front porches that enter directly into the units on Delafield. So that was one of the things to try and create a little bit more, pedestrian activity on that street because it has that kind of walkable character. All the other units are accessed through the main entrance. Even these have the ability to be accessed through the main entrance and the corridor of the building. There are two-story units elsewhere in the building. Even, for example, here on A2, those units along Delafield, those are two-story townhomes on the ground floor. And then you have two-story townhomes on the third and fourth floors. So that you have, again, multi-level units. Of the 94 units, 76 of them are one-story units. All the one-story units in a building that is served by an elevator are accessible or designed for in accordance with the Fair Housing Act and the accessibility codes in New Jersey. And even the ground floor or the lowest level of the two-story units are also on an accessible route. So folks that have mobility challenges, they can get around and get in and out of everything. Exterior design-wise, as you can see from the two renderings, there's a mix of materials and there's a lot of articulation going on. There are things that are happening as you move around the building, a lot of ins and outs in order to break up the building so it doesn't appear like a unarticulated box, but also up and down. You can see that the lowest three floors actually creating a bit of a cornice line and a setback so that there are real meaningful visual sight lines so that it breaks the perception of the building up. We realize it's a five-story building. We realize that it is on the public right-of-ways, that massing can't be really hidden from view. But it can be handled in a way that the building is perceived with different kinds of sight lines and it has visual interest. We believe that the combination of brick that we're using, especially down low and at the entrance up to the 3 stories, then we have the cementitious or hardy siding. In certain areas, some of that is in the form of shakes, which has, again, a different scale. And up top, we're using that hardy material in a panel form with battens. Actually, that's in response to one of the planner's comments. Originally, that had been envisioned as stucco. It has been since retranslated as hardy and panel type of. You can see that we're using very traditional kinds of detailing, whether it be the columns, the porches, the bay windows, the eaves and overhangs, the residential scale of windows. These are all meant for this to be a very, very inviting and an apartment building that relates well to its surroundings. So there's a lot of attention to offsets and material changes. It was noted that, and I'm going to refer back to Mr. Shelley's exhibit from one. It was noted that the garage is entered off of Courtlandt, so we want to keep all the vehicular traffic kind of consolidated in one area. That's why the trash room is immediately adjacent to that. And literally the garage goes very much to property line underneath. One of the reasons, and you've seen garages like this in other small apartment buildings. Sometimes those garages somehow seem to get above grade. This is designed so that the top of the garage is fully like 12 inches below grade, so you can get some planting depth. Not enough to get trees with a root system to it, but so that you can get actual turf, you can get actual shrubs that grow in these green areas on top of the garage area. Let's see what else. I'll refer briefly to, and this is simply a print of the same things that you have, so I don't know that you marked these exhibits. You can refer to them as...
They were already supplied as part of that.
Yes, they're exactly what was supplied.
Just refer to the sheet number.
Certainly. Something that hasn't been mentioned yet, this is referring to on sheet A2, which shows the ground floor plan. Adjacent to the corner entrance, there is a fitness center. It's a small fitness center. It can be well appointed. It's approximately 700 square feet, and that's for use of the residence itself. There's a management office on the ground floor, and And on each and every floor, there is a laundry area that is available to all residents and buildings. There's a trash room on each floor, again, feeding a compactor at the ground floor that's served off of Courtlandt Street. The building is fully fire suppressed. One of the things to note about the parking, there are 99 parking spaces for 94 units. 4 of those parking spaces are what we call tandem spaces. And basically it's area of the garage that is a little bit deeper, so we take advantage of that by doing tandem spaces, one car in front of the other. Generally, the applicant is going to be assigning spaces to the residents, and it's presumed that in a building of this size with 12 3-bedroom units and a bunch of 2-bedroom units, there will be some units that desire to rent 2 parking spaces. So those 4 tandem spaces are made available for that kind of overage. It's also assumed that not everyone will absolutely require parking spaces, because we've seen that as well. Generally, 1-to-1 is what this board and the city has found to be a very good workable mix for apartments. And even taking out the 4 tandems, we still have 95 spaces for 94 units. So we still achieve the 1-to-1 in that regard. I think that's about it, unless I missed something, which Tom will tell me about.
I think that's all. So I have no further questions for both of you.
Any member of the board have a question, please?
Question in terms of the bike racks.
Yes.
How will the bikers access that? Are they going to do it near where the cars?
The bikers will enter the garage because the bike racks are in the garage. They're actually, you can accommodate up to 50 bikes in and around the garage lobby area, so it's very close to that lobby and elevator in the garage area. But they will access the garage the same way that the vehicles do. And the ramp is not at a pitch of what we call a speed ramp, which is those very kind of steep ones. It's a relatively gradual ramp in compliance with the traffic standards.
The traffic is going to be coming in and out at the same time as
Correct.
the bikers.
Correct, and that's actually fairly common for garages that host bike racks as well. There's rarely a separate bike entrance. It's like a bicycle on any street or coming down any driveway. They have rules of the road that they have to look at as well. And again, the traffic folks will talk about the intensity of that use, but it's 94 units. It's not going to have tremendous amount of in and out all the time. And bikers can come, they can pause on the sidewalk, make sure it's clear, and they can go up and down.
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm just curious, why did you choose Courtlandt Street for the entrance for the garage and even for the garbage? Because in my mind, Courtlandt Street is the busiest of all the streets around there.
You're talking about it was probably a process of elimination, quite honestly. Number one, we didn't want to bring that traffic onto Delafield. We felt that was a quieter, more pedestrian street. The triangular configuration around the consolidated parcels and right-of-way made it pretty difficult to figure out an entrance to a garage that would be far enough away from intersections and things like that. Courtlandt Street actually gave us the longest stretch of street frontage that could be properly managed and would give enough sight lines to all of the different streets. So all those factors came in. So now I'm kind of reliving the process. So it wasn't any one thing, but I'm pretty sure that was a key consideration. It had to do a lot with sight lines.
Thank you.
Any other member have a question, comments? No. Seeing none.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
At this time, I would call Charles Olivo for testimony. And I'm sure he can answer that question.
State your name, spell your last name.
Charles Olivo, OLI, V as in Victor O.
You swear or affirm to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
You may proceed.
Mr. Olivo, since the last time you were before this board, have your credentials changed at all?
They have.
We will accept you as a
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I might, again, as I typically do, allow you to proceed with your analysis because you obviously did a review of traffic considerations for the project as well as parking considerations.
Yes, that's correct.
Since we know we had the question with regard to Courtlandt Street, maybe you might want to address that.
Absolutely. I can touch on that. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, pleasure to be back before you. As part of looking at this site and working with the project team on the redevelopment program, what we start with is an existing inventory of the roadway conditions, the roadways themselves, as well as the intersections. I think the project site engineer, as well as the architect, have done an excellent job in talking about some of the reconfigurations that are being proposed within the public roadway network. I'm referring back to Exhibit A1, where we're looking at the site centrally located and rendered. Generally to the north and east is where you have the university located, as well as some of your more major arterial roadways, Easton, College, George. These are the streets that really are generating the most traffic to and from this roadway network. Generally speaking, we're looking more at local roads, city roads that carry levels of traffic well below what you would see on some of those county arterial roadways. But those are important roadways because ultimately that's where the vehicular traffic is coming from and going to from projects such as this. So you've heard about the pre-existing uses, the roadway configurations. If you look historically at some of the development patterns in this area and the roadways themselves, the little triangular pieces that you see, which are landscaped and hardscaped today, if you go back to the 40s and 50s, they were just wide open areas of pavement. And what that's really a function of is Easton, Delafield, the other roadways are generally running parallel to one another, and then Central comes in at this skew. And the same thing happens with Courtlandt and then its intersection with Lewis Street, where you again are not intersecting at 90-degree angles. And so what's left over is kind of these wasteful or inefficient pieces of triangular land. And so what we're doing as part of the proposal, if you drive around this roadway network or if you walk within it or ride a bike, you'll see that there is pedestrian traffic, there's signage and what's called sharrows, which are pavement markings on the street, which are essentially telling motorists and bicyclists to share the road. So these are shared arrows. In complete street design, what we try to do is signal with pavement markings so that both motorists and bicycle traffic can use the same pavement area. And as part of the redevelopment program from a traffic perspective, and from just where we're located in close proximity to Rutgers and other areas of interest, we love to see projects that take older pieces of vehicular infrastructure, parking stalls that seemingly don't belong where they are, one-way pieces of roadway and legs that create these redundant stop bars. As you travel through this intersection, you often come upon stop bars relatively quickly. That's just not something conventionally that you would design from a traffic engineering perspective, that start and stop with the motorist and the vehicle. So as part of this redevelopment program, what we're doing is our part to recapture land that was previously used for motor vehicles and utilize it for the purposes of streetscape, street trees, landscaping, street furniture, which is very much in keeping with the redevelopment trends that you've seen throughout New Brunswick. So in many ways, I think the redevelopment plan that we have here is in keeping with the spirit of redevelopment that you see throughout the city. From a traffic perspective, we also look at some of the things that were asked before, which is, can motor vehicle traffic and bicycle traffic mix in the driveway? And in addition to that, where are we locating our access points to travel into and out of the site? The project architect spoke about that, and I would concur that When we look at the frontage of the roadways that we have from a continuous perspective, is it straight in alignment? Straight in alignment generally signals that the sight distance is acceptable for someone coming in or out of the driveway. They can look in both directions without roadways wrapping behind themselves or creating hidden spots within the roadway corridor. Spacing from intersection corners is always important as well. And then as it marries with the architectural design and the site design, as you come into the underground parking level, does the ramping work in terms of parking yields? So those are all important considerations as we look at the context of where we are. We start with that existing inventory, then we move into a future build condition. As you've heard, 94 residential units are being proposed with 99 parking stalls. The vehicular access and bicycle access to and from the site on Courtlandt Street, and some of the modifications from what I'll call a 5-leg intersection to a 4-leg intersection, or some of the overarching traffic and parking related changes of this project. From a parking perspective, generally speaking, within the city, we look for this 1-to-1 ratio. In some cases, on projects that I've worked on, we've been around 0.5, 0.75. Actually, this year, 2019, the Institute of Transportation Engineers published a new parking generation manual. It collects and amasses data from actual built projects throughout this region and throughout the country. And what we're finding in multifamily residential projects that are located in areas such as this, you're just over a half mile to the train station, just over a half mile to what I'll call the bus transit hub at Somerset and George. You're within 4 to 5 block walking radius of true places of interest. And that is the beauty of what New Brunswick has to offer, is that you don't have to go very far, whether you're walking or by bike, to find what you need, particularly in this area here. But what the ITE has shown in more recent studies is that on average you're seeing actual parking demand ratios, the number of utilized parked stalls within multifamily residential on average of about 0.7 per unit. And we're at about 1.05, so just over 1-to-1 here. What the IT has also done is started to look at where we're located, because we recognize that the RSIS is kind of this overlay on the state, but it doesn't say exactly what to use in certain areas. Your master plan re-examination talks about using realistic parking standards for where you're located within New Brunswick. And when you look at section 4.14C of RSIS, it states that alternative parking standards can and should be used in areas that are more walkable, that have urban or downtown characteristics, and that are in close proximity to public transit. So in that way, we can feel comfortable about relaxing what I'll call the standards that are within RSIS that apply to the whole state. And the IT has done this as well. If you're in a suburban area with a lack of walkability and a lack of public transit, well, then you're towards the higher end of these parking ratios. But this is exactly where we want to be within this particular area in New Brunswick, just over 1-to-1. And as you've heard, these are open to the market in terms of the residential units themselves. But because of where we are, we would expect that you don't necessarily need to own a vehicle to live in a unit complex such as this. So that's an important consideration as we look at the adequacy of parking. From a traffic generation perspective, based on where we are, looking at studies of similar projects, both in the area and within the ITE trip generation manual, we are below 30 peak hour trips coming in and out of the driveway that's located on Courtlandt. What the ITE, NJDOT, most jurisdictional agencies look at as a potential significant generator of traffic is a generator of traffic that increases traffic by 100 or more peak hour trips, and we are less than a third of that. So we would not expect this project to have a significant impact on the traffic levels, the levels of service throughout this area. And as you've heard, and I would just add on to, I believe by removing that 5-leg intersection, creating more of a 4-leg intersection at Central, we would have more conventional access to and from this neighborhood and improve the safety conditions of both pedestrian traffic, and I would add on both the pedestrian, bicyclist, as well as the vehicular traffic. So there's some nice improvements being made from a public roadway perspective as it relates to combining this type of redevelopment project with where we're located. We would not expect the project to have a significant impact on the levels of service throughout the area and the parking that's being proposed both for bicycle traffic, so we're accommodating with bike racks and parking supply for bicycle traffic, as well as the 99 parking stalls to be provided below ground. And I think for aesthetic purposes, the project architect has spoke about this as well, but many times you'll find that residential projects are built up with that ground level being sometimes used as a facade to block parking. But what we're doing here is we're bringing it all underground so that we can continue and wrap this building on its 3 frontages and really an attractive element of architecture. So the architecture, civil engineering, the traffic engineering, we're able to marry here in a way that really benefits both the site treatment as it exists today, previously a gas station, repair shop, single-family homes, in some cases being used for student housing, and now you have a modern development plan, integrated utilities, an excellent landscaping plan that essentially encompasses the entire site, streetscaping as well. So from a holistic perspective, works very well from a traffic perspective, but as we look at the elements of traffic and parking, we would not expect significant impacts on the area and the neighborhood.
Thank you, Mr. Leo. Any further questions?
Any member of the board have any questions? Seeing none,
Thank you. At this time, I would call for my final witness, Mr. Paul Greigel.
Please state your name, spell your last name.
Hi, Paul Greigel, last name spelled Grygiel.
Do you swear or affirm to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
You may proceed.
Mr. Greigel, you're a licensed professional planner in the state of New Jersey. is that
Yes,
correct?
since 1999.
In that capacity, you're familiar with the proposal and the variances before the board this evening?
I am.
I believe Mr. Greigel has testified here previously.
I have on a few
Yeah,
occasions.
yes, have your credentials haven't changed?
They have not.
We'll accept you.
Thank you.
I will allow you to proceed. You know the variances that are being requested and ask, hopefully you'll be able to support those variances to the board's satisfaction.
Certainly. I will try to be brief. We've heard a lot of testimony already, but I'd just like to recap some main points. The property is an assemblage of multiple parcels. It's almost an acre in area, so it's somewhat unique for this portion of New Brunswick. The zoning is split into 2 districts, so we do have the R5A residential as well as the C1 commercial zone. Multifamily residential is not permitted in either zone, although the C1 zone does allow mixed use, but we do require a use variance. There are certain other variances that were adequately described by the applicant's attorney and engineer, and also in Mr. Bignell's letter, so I'm not going to run through each of those again. Instead, I'd rather start with the use variance proofs and then continue with the other variance proofs. As the board's, I'm sure, well aware, for a D1 use variance, an applicant must meet both the positive and negative criteria, demonstrating site suitability for a particular use. In this instance, the positive criteria, in my opinion, is met for a number of reasons. First, the city's master plan identifies a need in New Brunswick for a full spectrum of housing options, including a wide range of housing and lifestyle choices and non-student rental housing. As we've said, this project will most likely attract student housing, but again, it's intended not to be solely for that type of market. The land use vision for this section of the city also does talk about upgrading and enhancing the aesthetic character, redeveloping the older neighborhood, in this case replacing existing older housing stock and a commercial use that is past its prime and in fact is contaminated with a new attractive building. The proposal is also very consistent with the city's stated objective to consolidate multifamily housing in high-quality new buildings. In this case, again, we're looking to do just that. So for all the reasons we've heard from the other experts tonight, I think what's proposed here is very consistent with the master plan's efforts to rehabilitate this section of the city, notwithstanding that the use itself does require a use variance. but it is close to shops, services, the university, certainly hospital, jobs, transportation, all the types of things that you'd like to see in the vicinity of a multifamily housing project of this type. And in fact, to support the parking variance, it's also an appropriate location for 0 or 1 car households. So for those reasons, I think the proposal is on a property that is particularly suitable for this type of housing and this scale of housing. In particular, there's the frontage on the multiple streets, so it does allow for, as shown on Exhibit A1, a more open setting than you have for a typical site. Again, there's a gateway type projects we've been called previously. In this instance, it allows for additional height for a more attractive, larger building that still can fit into the neighborhood context. Likewise, the size of the property itself, well over the minimum required, allows for additional flexibility with regard to the use, the building height, floor area ratio, coverage, and all their standards. So I think for those reasons, the positive criteria would be met for the use variance. With regard to the negative criteria, we need to demonstrate there be no substantial detriment to the public good and to the zone plan and zoning ordinance. I think the design has been well described by the other experts, but the idea here is really to improve the streetscape, to try to make traffic consolidated to one location for access to and from the site. In fact, we'll be placing a number of curb cuts or long curb cuts with a single access point for cars, for bikes, along an existing street that is heavily traveled. So as far as providing for open space along the property, we also have that as well with the consolidation of the properties and the taking back of the public right-of-way. So I think as far as negative impacts, again, any development would have negative potential impacts, but in this case, I think the site is designed to try to mitigate those through architectural and site design, through the scaling of the building to step it down to the more residential areas to have a more townhouse type product along the northern frontage of the property. So I think for those reasons, the negative criteria are met with regard to the public good. With regard to the master plan and zoning ordinance, just to recap, I think we're thoroughly consistent with the city's planning objectives for this section of New Brunswick. As far as the height and FAR variances are concerned, I think they very much relate to the size and location of the property and its proposed use. Again, we are taller than what's permitted. The property is more intense in terms of FAR. But the master plan re-examination for the city does talk about graduated density. Essentially, with larger sites, you can have more flexibility in design to maybe allow for additional development. In this case, I think it can be offset by allowing for having the multiple frontages, but also allowing for the fully underground parking. That's a key benefit here, that it's, as Mr. Olivo said, providing for a better streetscape by not having essentially a wrapped garage, but having actual uses along the first floor. So I think that certainly is a consideration with regard to the FAR. Likewise with the building and lot coverage, that there are similar factors at work here. That essentially this type of use requires additional coverage, but in this case I think it can be accommodated. In fact, the lot coverage, is actually conservative. As we heard, there will be more green space than it actually sounds like from the number of 97+%. There actually is shown on A1, there's additional green space on top of the garage that's not accounted for in the lot coverage. With regard to the other C variances being sought, we do comply well with proposed setbacks. We have the issue potentially with the underground garage, the setbacks not being met, but again, it would not be visible. So I think that's really a technical variance. We do have a potential issue with regard to buffering of the 10-foot to residential use. Again, I think it's not clear where in the ordinance that standard is, but the idea of providing some separation is met. It was discussed there would be a wall and a fence to the east along the properties along Central Avenue. So I think the intention of providing some separation is provided. In fact, this proposal does have green space around every side of the building. So I think for those reasons, the bulk variances would be addressed and can be granted under the C2 criteria where the benefits outweigh any detriments. Lastly, with regard to parking, I can't probably say it much better than the previous witness, Mr. Olivo, but he explained how this site would actually enhance the transportation within the area, does address pedestrian and bicycle circulation, complete streets. While we're deficient on parking, I think what's proposed is in line with what's acceptable in this section of New Brunswick in more urban developments nowadays. So I think the ratio of 1-to-1 for parking to units makes absolute sense here, and again, I think would not have any detrimental impacts on the city, on the surrounding area, especially as Again, this is a location close to transit, close to services, et cetera. So with that, I'd be glad to continue, but I think I've addressed all the variances that are requested.
I have no further questions, Mr. Fraggle.
Any member of the board have a question or comment for this witness? Seeing none?
I just had one point of clarification. Mr. Kreigel?
Yes.
Did you testify that the C variances can be granted in both the flexible and the hardship standard?
I was just testifying to the C2, the benefits outweighing the detriments. As far as, I didn't suggest as a hardship for the coverage. It's a brand new building, we're consolidating the property, so I don't think it's, in my opinion, I don't think we need to address that. But I think there's more than adequate proofs that would exist for the C2 proofs.
Thank you.
No. Mr. Telford, the next witness?
That completes our presentation.
Okay. So at this time, I'll open it up to the public. Any member of the public that has questions or comments, please come forward. Just, we'll give you a little time to talk and this and that, but if there's a lot of other people that want to speak, we do have a limit of how long, but if there's time towards the end, we will let you come back up and speak. Okay? So just please be aware of that. Come on up.
Please state your name, spell your last name.
Elizabeth Ciccone, C-I-C-C-O-N-E.
C-I-C-C-O-N.
C-I-C-C-O-N-E.
You swear or affirm to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
You may proceed.
Firstly,
Mr. Cohn, your address also?
52 Welton Street in New Brunswick.
52.
Welton Street,
Thank you.
W-E-L-T-O-N.
Thank you.
Firstly, it wasn't clear to me exactly how many homes they're expecting to tear down. Can that be stated?
Yeah. Yes, here we'll ask the professional.
Can that be stated?
Sure.
Yeah, we have the answer, we just have to.
There are a total of 4 dwellings located on Delco Street, as well as the garage and maintenance facility located on Duke Street. So in total, between the 8 properties, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 structures in total, including some accessory structures.
So it sounds like 7 homes and the garage building?
Correct.
Has any cultural resources survey been performed to determine whether those homes and the garage have any cultural significance in our city? Has the City of New Brunswick Historical Association Board reviewed these plans to check whether there would be any detriment to historical items within the city?
How would we know that?
I'm asking, have they done it? They could do it. They're allowed to. You're allowed to ask them to.
The applicant has submitted an environmental impact statement, which typically would include anything that involved any cultural impact. And there was nothing identified.
Who performed the cultural resources survey? Did it comply with the Section 106 standards of the National Historic Preservation Act?
It's not required.
Is any federal funding being used to produce this project?
No.
It's 100% funded by private funds.
Yes.
And who was the expert that determined that no cultural resources were being impacted?
Mid-Atlantic Engineering did the environmental impact statement.
That's an environmental statement. What about the cultural resources portion?
The environmental impact statement includes all impacts, including cultural impacts, if any.
And which member of the engineering team has credentials on historical resources that could therefore prove that there were no historical resources being impacted?
It is not required to have the credentials because the information is available through public access. And the requirement of an environmental impact statement is to research those resources to determine whether or not there would be potentially any impact.
Was the environmental resources survey actually vetted by the New Brunswick Environmental Board?
It's reviewed internally by the city staff. The staff could best answer that.
All projects are relayed over to the environmental commission before they hit our technical advisory commission, and if they have any comments, they send them to me to relay to our technical advisory. There were no comments received on this project as far as I can tell.
I think that it's a real shame that everyone is willing to tear down a bunch of homes without actually making sure that there's nothing worth saving. The testimony of people that are obviously testifying on behalf of tearing things down and who don't actually have credentials to back that, I think that maybe this board should consider getting an opinion from people who actually have credentials. Also, taking out the right-of-way and giving a paved thing instead of a piece of grass destroys the cultural heritage of the neighborhood. The fact that that has kind of wonky, not 90-degree corners is part of what makes this area pleasant to live in. That it's not cookie cutter, that it's not like everywhere else. The fact that they're asking for a 97% variance over 90, who here is educated well enough to tell me that 7% is not meaningful? One or two other comments, I'm just going to check my own notes. In terms of 99 versus 179 parking spaces, obviously 80 parking spaces being missing is kind of absurd in this neighborhood, but the general attitude that this neighborhood does need housing, I actually agree with. All I'm saying is, can we check before we tear down a bunch of things, before we put up one giant thing? It's also essentially that they want to remove that island as a convenience to them. They were basically asked why they picked the one side to put the entrance, and basically they said because it worked best for us, not because it worked best for the neighborhood, not because it worked best for parking, but because it was the most convenient way to arrange the building they want to build. That has nothing to do with what's appropriate to the people that live in the neighborhood. I don't think that the green space that was here was wasteful. I think that people who live in that neighborhood enjoyed that, despite the fact that it might be somewhat inconvenient for the street traffic that these people would like to have.
What green space are you talking about that's there
The
now?
little median strip that they're trying to take out and put essentially a piece of pavement. You know, the variance that they've already asked the city for to get rid of a piece of green space in the middle.
It's really a street and a parking lot that they're looking to.
And, you know, they're basically saying that that's a wasteful and inefficient use of land. That is actually a direct quote from one of these people. And I would suggest that it's what makes neighborhoods nice. And I don't think that's wasteful or inefficient. Thank you.
Please state your name, spell your last name.
Michael Kaplan, last name is Kaplan.
Okay. Do you swear or affirm to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
You may proceed.
Mr. Kaplan, your address, please?
I have multiple on the block, so.
How about where you live?
Okay, I don't live there either, so, but 52 Delafield is the primary
You
spot.
own that property?
Yeah, and so I have vested amount of interest on that block for many years, and I think this would be a huge, awesome building for the area. I'm not leaving my other properties on the block either. I think it complements the neighborhood, it complements the school, both hospitals, you know, you're surrounded by both, and I think it's a viable project. The students love it. I think it brings from Easton Avenue over college community, and it doesn't have that stigma, so bring more kids over, and I don't know, I'm all for it, and I think that, I hope that you guys you've seen that also.
Thank you. Any other member of the public have questions, comments? Charlie, come on up.
state your name, spell your last name, and give your address?
Charlie Kratovil, Kratovil.
Do you swear or affirm to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do, and I'm a New Brunswick resident for the past 15 years. Much of that time I spent living in the 5th and 6th wards in New Brunswick, so I'm very familiar with this area. I live very close to it.
Mr. Crandall, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Your address also.
I'd rather not give
Yeah, business address is fine.
my P.O. box. Sure. P.O. Box 3180, New Brunswick, New Jersey. So, on April the 29th, I filed a records request under the Open Public Records Act, that's known as OPRA, using the website Oprah Machine, requesting the application and the attachments from Recon Services. On May 9th, I was told I can pick it up on a disc if I pay $5, and I kind of tried to clarify what kind of disc is this. And then on May 10th, I was given a link to a Google Drive folder that includes what appears to be the entirety of the application. And one of the files in that folder was a waiver request that says, quote, "The applicant is requesting a waiver from submitting an environmental impact statement as this project proposed the redevelopment of existing disturbed infill lots. An EIS, environmental impact statement, would prove very little benefit." So when I hear Mr. Kelso state that one was submitted, I'm now concerned that I haven't gotten all the documents I need to be able to review this. And for the record, I am objecting to this application. I don't have counsel, but I would like to understand what date was the environmental impact statement prepared, when was it submitted, and why wasn't it provided to me in response to my OPRA request?
I'm sure we can answer why it wasn't provided as part of your Oprah request, since we don't handle our request. Go ahead, clerk's office.
So, Mr. Chairman, just in the master file, there was an environmental impact statement. It looks like it's dated February 28th, 2019. It looks like it was prepared by Atlantic Engineering Partners. And it consists of 6 pages plus an appendix, approximately 7 additional pages.
Thank you, sir. And so I would like to understand, was there a waiver request?
The waiver request was withdrawn and we provided the environmental impact statement.
Okay. Well then, respectfully, as somebody who cares about this neighborhood and cares about these meetings, cares about these developments, I would just request a copy of the environmental impact statement and for you to, adjourn this hearing until such time as we can review that and respond to it.
It's been on file with the city. The applicant objects to that. The fact that his Oprah request wasn't answered the way he wished it to be, and timing-wise, I can't answer that, but the applicant's not going to stand to be prejudiced by it.
On what date was the EIS withdrawn?
No, the EIS wasn't withdrawn, the waiver.
I'm sorry, when was the waiver request withdrawn?
I think the way we handled it was we requested a waiver initially, changed our mind, and just submitted the EIS. So I don't recall whether or not we actually said we are withdrawing the waiver. We just submitted the EIS.
Okay. This is understandably led to confusion. This is very important. I'm concerned about the environment. It's one of the primary things I'm concerned about. And we've got a situation here where there's an oversized building proposed in need of numerous variances, some 670 cubic yards of contaminated soil, groundwater contamination in need of remediation, and 26 trees being removed. So obviously it was inappropriate to request a waiver of an environmental impact statement under these circumstances. I understand that the applicant may have changed their mind, but that doesn't change the fact that good people who wanted to know what was going on were under the impression that the EIS was the subject of a waiver request, and there wouldn't be any EIS. And so, you have the power to adjourn this hearing, and I hope that you will use your power for good and not rush this. I understand Mr. Kelso can object, and he's representing his client, as he always does. but if the city is truly interested in getting the best possible public comment, the most public feedback, I think it only makes sense that the city share with the public the documents that are on file, and so I would humbly request that you please do adjourn this hearing. Would that be something you'd be willing to do? Because then I'll just save it for next time.
I object.
Mr. Chairman, it's the applicant who can make a request or must grant permission to adjourn it. The documents are produced, there are two different vehicles here that are involved, two different sets of rules. One is Oprah, and under Oprah, I can't opine about why those documents were or weren't provided to them. Under the municipal land use law, which is what governs this board, the application and all supporting documents must be available for public view. And that is at the office, and the address is also given as the notice is going out to the public and to residents within 200 feet. Those documents are available as part of the file. They were available at least 10 days prior to the hearing date of today. And so that would not be a reason to make some other objection if he wishes, or some other one to listen. But that wouldn't be a reason unless there is consent of the applicant to adjourn it, or to postpone the decision by the board if the board decides to act today.
Thank you.
Okay, well, irrespective of that, you still do have the power to not make a decision tonight for whatever reason. And I hope that you will sincerely hit the pause button and make sure that we get the public to have the information we need to be able to give the input that this board needs. That's a simple request. I'll leave it to you. I hope you'll do the right thing. I'll also explain why I'm so concerned about this. So not only is there, part of this site that's in the process of being environmentally remediated, but I want to draw your attention to an investigation that was done by the State Commission on Investigation. It was nicknamed the Dirty Dirt Investigation, and there was a May 25th, 2016 hearing in Trenton at the State House, and in that hearing, one of the revelations was that 55 Morrell Street was the source of contaminated construction waste that ended up in an unapproved, mob-connected dumping ground near the Delaware River in Palmyra. And of course, 55 Morrell Street is one of the other projects that Recon Services did with the approval of this board in the city of New Brunswick. So here we are now with more contaminated dirt and a legitimate concern that what happened last time was improper and illegal, and I can't say for sure whether this applicant had anything to do with that, but at the end of the day, the dirt from that site was illegally accepted. This place in Palmyra accepted contaminated fill, and more than 19 times the amount of waste they were allowed to, and so the dirt from the Recon Services project was contaminated with an unacceptable level of benzoapyrene, which is a PAH, a polycyclical aromatic hydrocarbon, and that stuff ended up in this place, and a letter was doctored to make it seem like everything was above board when it wasn't. And so I would like to ask, what is the plan to remove the dirt from this site, and where will it be taken?
Well, first of all, let me just say that Mr. Cradaville's commentary with regard to Morrell Street is totally irrelevant to this land use application. But having said that, just to give the board the benefit of the information that's available to me, is that Mr. Pavlicek was requested by the state to provide documentation with regard to everything that he had available to him on the Morrell Street site, so that they could continue with their investigation. Not to investigate him, but to continue their investigation as to whatever company that was available to remove that, and how the contamination, if it did actually come from Morrell Street, ended up there. That was in 2016. He provided the documentation. The state has not contacted him since. And with regard to this site, as the board has heard, our licensed site remediation professional, who is licensed by the state, has provided testimony with regard to what will occur with regard to the removal of the soil that's contaminated, and in fact, the removal of that contaminated soil will now enhance and accelerate the remediation of this site. How that soil is removed, again, is under the auspices of the licensed site. Licensed and remediation professional who will be, have oversight over that. That's licensed by the state. How that's going to occur, when it's going to occur, where it's going to go, that isn't decided.
Okay, and can I just get the name of the firm that is the LSRP? I know Mr.
Midland.
Sisti's one. Oh, it's the same firm
Same
that's
one,
doing the
yes.
engineering. Is that a
Yes.
conflict?
You must have, what? How would it be a conflict? I know you like conflicts, Charlie.
I'm
That's
just
not a
doing my
conflict.
job. I gotta ask. It's not a conflict for somebody who's doing the project to also be doing this for it?
No, I mean, most LSRPs, if not all of them, are associated with engineering firms.
Okay. So how about the chlorinated solvents? Is that just in the dirt or is that in the water as well?
I'll let Mr. Sisti answer that.
It was found originally in the soil when we took the tanks out, and then it was found more recently in the groundwater.
Okay, and gasoline as well,
And
in
yes,
the water?
yeah.
And so how do you clean that up? What's the plan?
So contaminated soil, the plan is to excavate that as part of the development. That would be disposed of at a recycling facility, soil recycling facility. And then the groundwater, ideally, if the conditions are right, we can do natural attenuation. We can monitor that once the source is removed, the soil. If that does not appear to be happening, then in a situation like this where it's an urban area, we're very limited as to what we can do, but typically something like that, we use low-level hydrogen peroxide in the groundwater to oxidize contamination.
Okay.
Similar to putting it on peroxide on a cut.
Thank you. So there are a few other, smaller issues I wanted to address if I still have time, or do you want me? Okay.
Well, let me just,
Yeah.
is there anyone else in the audience that would like to come up and talk? Not seeing them, Charlie, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. So I concur with the question from the esteemed former chair. I do think Courtlandt is the busiest street of all of them, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to have the only in and out point for cars to be on there. I think that really anywhere but there would be better. That's just my opinion. But I am concerned because a lot of people do come from Easton Avenue, still coming quite fast around this area, and I wouldn't want anyone to get hurt in a crash or an accident. I want to know about the city land here. That this is, I guess it's the right of way, so it's the sidewalk, the street. Then there's that little island and the public parking that would all be necessary for the developer to acquire in order to make this happen. And I want to understand what the cost of that acquisition will be. The city's not going to give it away for free, are they?
No.
Okay, and will the applicant agree to an appraisal? Is that how it's going to be done? Or?
If this board were to approve the application, there would be a condition of approval that the city of New Brunswick would need to convey the right-of-way to us. The terms associated with that conveyance would have to be dictated by the city. So if the city determined a value based upon assessment, since we've had a recent reval, that would be one approach. Another approach would be to require an appraisal. And then the city council would have to make a determination, and my client would have to consider whether or not they would proceed based upon what that value is. But it's certainly not expected that it's going to be for free. And the procedure that the city would come up with in order to determine the value is really up to the city.
Thank you, sir. It was alluded to that the applicant is the purchaser of the property, and so with respect to the other 8 properties, have they been purchased yet? Are they under contract?
Properties are under control. That's how we have jurisdiction to be here. Contract purchasers.
I see. And, I will just say that I do disagree with the efforts to recapture land that's owned by the city. Real estate is the biggest business in New Jersey, and the city giving up some of its land doesn't strike me as a good public policy, especially if that land is going to be used for a purely private purpose like this. I I also just don't think there's many examples of that, at least in my time in New Brunswick. I can't think of any time the city gave away a street. I think maybe near the Walgreens it might have happened, but it's not a good policy. I think what we've seen here is, they got rid of Jetland Street, but they replaced it with a block of Kirkpatrick Street, and we've actually added Zebra Way. It's a new road in New Brunswick. So I don't think we should be in the business of getting rid of public rights of way, because they are the most important public spaces, our streets. And while I understand that there could be some improvements made to traffic flow in the area, I don't think the answer is to just give it away to a private developer. And so that's another reason I'm objecting to this project today. I do think that it's not in the city's best interest to give away its land to somebody who's just going to build housing.
I'm going to counter it, because I think they've already said the city isn't giving it away. They're purchasing it off the city for a price that is met fairly, whether it's through the reevaluations that were just done or an appraisal that comes out. So they're not giving anything away. It's being purchased.
Price to be determined later.
Before the city gives it away, they're not going to give it to them and then say, oh, give me $1 for it.
I'm glad it's not going to be a $1 sale, but nevertheless, I still don't think it's a good public policy for the city to be offloading its own real estate. The value of real estate has increased over time here in New Brunswick, and I don't think it's in the city's best interest to give it or sell it to private interests. And I guess the one final thing I'll ask, very politely, I appreciate all your patience. There's a bus that goes right past here, the New Brunswick shuttle. Would there be any way that somewhere near the building the applicant would be willing to pay to erect and maintain a bus shelter so that their tenants could be able to avail themselves of that bus service and hopefully cut down on the demand for parking?
You ask that every time, Charlie.
And many times people say yes.
I think I don't know if the shuttle doesn't actually run along here right now. You would know, I know you know where they all run, but if the shuttle were to run by here, then I believe that we would be happy to put a bus shelter there. But I don't think the shuttle runs by there now.
I believe the New Brunswick shuttle does, maybe not in the summer, but it is a joint venture of the Parking Authority, the Rutgers and NJDOT. It's been going around since, let's say, 2006. And I actually used to live right over here, and I remember, riding that bus and catching it right here on Lewis Street. One of the downsides is there's no shelter, no place to wait. You kind of have to flag the bus down, and not a lot of people know that, so not a lot of people use it. But if you put a shelter with the places it goes and the times it comes, then you're more likely to have people using it. And since there's a new building potentially going in, I do think that would be one way to make it a little better for the community. So I hope.
Again, I would say for the record, the applicant would review it depending on where the shuttle was and where they would want to have a shelter, but it would be purely voluntary on the part of my client to do that. But there wouldn't be a reason not to do it if there's an appropriate place, because it would benefit the tenants.
Well, I agree. So the developer's not willing to make it a condition of approval?
I would object to it being a condition because we don't have enough information.
Okay, well, I'll be around. I'll follow it. Thank you.
Any other members of the public wish to comment or speak on this project? Seeing none, the public portion will be closed.
Thank you. I'll just defer to the board. I think we've spent enough time talking about it. I just would want to say that it is a remarkably well-designed building. That I think we've seen the work that Steve Schock has done before. It really adds a real stable, coalescing building for this location. I think it's, aside from the city getting the benefit of the new housing, it's a new rateable for the city, and I think it's well worth the variance of the and I hope you will consider it to be the same.
Board comments? Discussion? Yeah. The drainage on the right side.
Yes.
Could you just explain a little bit more?
Sure. So with the
Proposed development, and again, as I mentioned, that we were, as part of the impervious coverage, we were counting the entire subsurface parking area. There's a slight increase in the impervious coverage on the site. So what we did was we were collecting portions of the site, sending it to a subsurface perforated pipe, which will store, hopefully infiltrate, as long as the soil conditions are adequate and as long as the groundwater contamination is able to be remediated. We wouldn't want to be promoting additional infiltration into an area that has contaminated groundwater. But the idea is there would be an underground pipe, the pipe would hold the water and slowly let it out so that the runoff generated on this proposed site is less than the runoff that's currently there today.
Dry well?
Essentially a dry well, yes. Instead of a concrete vault, it would be a longer perforated pipe instead. And if the groundwater is not good, then we will simply not do a perforated pipe.
Any other discussion?
I guess my comments are, in looking and reviewing this application prior to tonight's meeting, I know there was a question about the exit onto Courtlandt Street. But when I looked at it, if you look at an exit onto Delavan, it's going to come out and face somebody's house. So streetlights are going to be in and out there. I think the Courtlandt Avenue, Courtlandt Street exit makes more sense because it doesn't happen there. And the other question, I guess, or comment was in relation to the front entry. The front entry, I think, is really located in a particularly good situation because, again, people coming in and out of the building are not coming out onto somebody else's front lawn. They're coming out into an intersection, which, again, is easy access for them to go different ways.
The only reason I asked that question is because there's parking on Courtlandt Street. And Courtlandt Street is small, really, when there's parked cars on both sides. So that's why I asked that question. Because you put a driveway there now, and you have parked cars there, it makes accessibility, you know, a little iffy, and it makes access and visibility a little iffy.
But would it be better on Delavan?
I have no idea. That's why I asked the question.
Yeah, I think that street is a little smaller.
I was just kind of asking. But I do have a question. So where the parking garage is, would the applicant consider putting a mirror for visibility purposes when coming out of the garage for both pedestrian and vehicle?
I would defer to, to the professionals, but it would seem the appropriate thing to do. They may have been going to be doing it anyway.
Right, they may have been, but I think it would be positive.
Yes.
Any other discussion? Seeing none.
And Mr. Chairman, just on the parking discussion the board was just having, I did have in my notes that the applicant agreed to waive the purchase of local parking permits. So the applicant's tenants would not be able to park on that side of.
I neglected to
Courtlandt
make
Street.
that representation.
But anyone
we will
else,
waive that.
anyone else in the neighborhood would be able to
Can do
provide.
that.
And so long as the city continues to allow parking on that street.
Sure. No. Seeing no more discussion, do you want to list any conditions that we would have to, to have approval?
So standard conditions would include compliance with the terms of the DNR engineering report dated May 17, 2019, submission of any necessary easements or cross-access agreements by the board attorney and city engineer, payment of a site performance bond in an amount reviewed and approved by the city engineer, submission of a site inspection escrow deposit for engineering inspection fees in an amount calculated pursuant the ordinance submitted to the city engineer, payment of all water and sewer connection fees, payment of a road opening permit from the city engineer if required. Compliance with the terms of the Big Nell Planning Consultants Report dated May 9, 2019. Mandatory monetary contribution to the city's Tree Preservation Trust Fund in an amount to be determined by ordinance and the TAC. Planning review escrow funded for all anticipated post-approval reviews. Payment of any outstanding taxes and or water or sewer fees. Middlesex County Planning Board approval or waiver. Freehold Soil Conservation District approval or waiver. Filing of a lot consolidation deed or plat, Mr. Kelso. Deed. That's fine. Submit engineering site plan to comply with any changes required by the planning or engineering memos. Submit architectural plans to comply with any changes required by the planning or engineering memos offered at the hearing. The special conditions would include submit documentation of city council approval for the Central Avenue loading area. Submit documentation of city council conveyance of the right-of-way. That would be the Central Ave. Central Duke right-of-way. All utilities and other site improvements to be maintained by the applicant at their sole expense. All on-site utilities to be constructed underground. All temporary encroachments in the public right-of-way shall require city council approval. All construction staging shall be done on-site unless an encroachment allowing to the public right-of-way is approved by the city council. Streets shall be kept clean of sediment and debris. The applicant shall cause the streets to be cleaned if directed to do so by the director of public works. Tracking pads shall be installed at all construction exits. Replacement of any damaged streets, curbs, and sidewalks as per the direction of city engineer. The applicant will schedule a pre-construction meeting with the city engineer department. Installation of a weather-protected bicycle parking facility. Voluntary waiver of the right for occupants of the subject development to obtain residential or business residential. On-street parking permits. Trash and recycling pickup to be provided by a private hauler as necessary. The variances are for floor area ratio, building height, building coverage, impervious coverage, parking, and a design waiver for the landscape buffer width.
Do I have a motion with that?
I have one additional,
Okay.
actually two additional. One is no construction permit shall be issued until applicant obtains an RAO from the NJDEP. And finally, the applicant should install a mirror at the exit from the garage to enhance visibility and safety.
Can I just, I heard you say the variances, I put you this one. Building height, building coverage, impervious coverage, FAR, parking. TBD.
FAR, building height, impervious coverage, building coverage, parking.
And then the setback for the parking from the property line?
So
Technical.
that's it, yeah, so it's listed here under design waiver for parking stall setback.
Okay. And then the design waiver for the lighting? I think that's it.
Lighting level design waiver.
All right, do I have a motion?
I'll make a motion.
I'll second.
Hey, you second?
Yes.
Evelyn Ascona,
Yes.
Nancy Coppola,
Yes.
Doug Sheehan,
Yes.
John Zimmerman,
Yes.
Ted Chester,
Yes.
Ivan Adorno, John Cox.
Yes. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.